We're going to take a quick look at some of the material in Chapter 1. Chapter 1 in this week is kind of an easier, slower moving week to introduce some of the topics and some of the different bodies of thought in psychology. As we move through the rest of the content, we will go into a bit more depth. So I just want to walk you through some basics and give you a little background on myself. So my undergraduate degree is in biochemistry, and through just life happening, I wound up moving to Southeast Kansas, where there's not a lot of biochemistry jobs. So I had a health and became a child and adolescent case manager with very little actual background in psychology. I had one psychology course by that point in my life, but I got an A+ in it, and that was in fact general psychology, which is the class you're in right now. But I learned a lot, and my science background and kind of working a social services job, working in the field of psychology really got me interested in neuroscience. Also, not a lot of neuroscience jobs in Southeast Kansas. So after I stopped working as a case manager, I honestly, because of the hours involved, left case management to work in education, believe it or not. And so once I got a job with more stable hours, I went back to school and got my master's in psychology. So that's a little bit on my background, and I think that will help make my approach to certain topics in this class make a little bit more sense to you, kind of show you some insight into my perspective. I've had my master's for 4 years now. During the time I was working on my master's, I became a foster parent. So I have a variety of experience with the field. So one of the common questions that I get from students is, I don't want to be a therapist or a teacher, so why am I in this class? So it turns out that there's a lot of good information. Okay, so there's a lot of good information in especially general psychology, a lot of stuff that you can take and apply to just about any area of your life. And so one of the reasons why I like teaching general psychology is that you may not be interested in every single chapter, and I guarantee I'm going to be a lot more excited about certain chapters than you guys will be, but usually somebody finds something that they're interested in over the course of the semester. So with my approach to teaching psychology, I like to focus on transferable skills rather than just semester outcomes and syllabus stuff. So what I'm going to do with this first brief lecture is to just kind of give you an overview of some stuff with psychology. So the first thing is, what can you do with psychology aside from my whole transferable skills focus? So there are a number of careers. If you look at this chart, and I believe this is the chart included in the most recent edition of your textbook. I believe it's on page 28 and 29. So there are a number of fields that have people with psychology backgrounds working in them. Some of them probably aren't too surprising, like social work, but other ones, there's a variety of management positions and sales positions where people have psychology background, and then down toward the bottom you see healthcare positions. So the other question is, well, how much of an book, or actually it looks like I pulled it from a different source. So that kind of gives you a breakdown of where people with doctorates. So this would be, you've got a 4-year bachelor's degree in psychology and now you've pursued additional education. So there's also some career data, which I show this. Let's make sure that this link is still active. So this is published by the US government. So this includes some basic population data. So this actually shows you the average income of people in their careers with bachelor's degree by field of study. So you can see just kind of going down the list, and also be careful whenever you look at income data at a federal level, because the coasts make more money than the Midwest does, so always kind of keep that in mind. So you see that social work and human services is kind of down at the bottom. And then you can actually just kind of peruse that on your own time. So a lot of times I talk to students where they want to make the most money, and then you go to the state and you go, oh, it's got to be up here. But I do want to remind you that there's a lot of transferable skills within the field of psychology, so that's one of the reasons why we take the time to study it. So I'm going to skip ahead over some of these slides. In previous semesters, I've taught Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 combined, so that's kind of how this PowerPoint is laid out. So I'm just going to skip ahead. We're going to talk about the historical foundations. Now, you'll notice my somewhat snarky old dead white guys subtitle, and I want to preface that for you. There was a bias early in the study of psychology. If you really look at the way back, you know, several hundred years ago, most of the people that studied psychology weren't really studying psychology. Psychology as a science is only about as old as the light bulb. They were philosophers, and so you had to have money to be able to sit around and be a philosopher. You may have had a patron or someone else, and so there's not been a lot of time where we have studied psychology as a science. So it's one of the things that we're going to discuss in the historical foundations. You will also notice a lot of the early work in psychology was mostly male and mostly Caucasian and European. And that creates some bias. And so that's something that we'll talk about as we continue to move through this class, is just kind of the shift in how psychology has been studied. All right, so psychology is about 130 years old, but has its roots in philosophy, as I've already mentioned. So there are several different perspectives that form different schools of thought in the early study of psychology, once it was recognized as psychology and not just philosophy. So Wilhelm Wundt, and there's his pertinent dates, he's created his laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, in the late 1870s. And most credit this with the first actual psychology laboratory, the first real, genuine attempt to turn psychology into something that appeared scientific. So he's often credited as the father of modern psychology. It's true that there were other people doing other work contemporary to him, but he gets a lot of the credit. So he was interested in studying the human mind by a process called objective introspection. So he was interested in the study of consciousness. And honestly, a lot of early psychology and even philosophers were interested in the consciousness, or what makes a person, what makes someone human, what motivates them. So he studied objective introspection. He trained his associates. Okay, sorry, I'm still trying to figure out this recording software. I apologize for this first longer recording. Anyway, so he trained his lab workers. All right, sorry about the pause. I was trying to get to the proper place in our textbook. The Wundt and structuralism conversation starts on page 8 of your textbook. So the objective introspection, or introspection, was basically his attempt to measure internal perception. So he trained observers in the way to measure that and observe and report it. One of the criticisms, though, of this particular form of psychology is, although it was an attempt to do some laboratory science kind of stuff, that it was not objective enough, but it's often recognized as the first attempt at some sort of objectivity. So again, you can read more about that on page 8 of your textbook. Okay, so Edward Titchener, a contemporary of Wundt, gets some credit as well. So he was actually a student of the last person we talked to. So basically, he took Wundt's core ideas and elaborated on them. So he believed that each perceptual experience could be broken down into its parts, into emotions and sensations, and that there was something meaningful in breaking an experience down into its parts. As we go through this class, the one thing that will come up over and over again is that in the field of psychology, we all argue with each other. And so his series did not last very long due to infighting. One of the reasons why Titchener maintains some importance is he was actually the first person to grant a woman a PhD in psychology. It was generally felt in the early study of psychology that women were just in the way and could not make meaningful contributions because they should be mothers instead. And as callous as it sounds for me to say that, there was quite a bit of sexism early in the field of psychology. Okay, so William James is credited with the study of functionalism. So he was less interested in internal perceptions and wanted to know how your consciousness would impact everyday life. So he didn't think that you could directly measure consciousness through internal objective introspection or anything like that. He really wanted to just measure the impact. So how does one's mind allow them to function in the real world? How do they work and play and adapt? Can we use the behaviors of people to learn something about how they adapt? So functionalism was fairly popular for those that were not comfortable with the direct study of consciousness because they felt like it could not be directly measured. So in a face-to-face class, sometimes we discuss the differences between structuralism and functionalism. It's not necessarily something that we need to do here. I've decided against assigning a forum to that, so we're going to continue to move on. So another popular area of psychology is Gestalt psychology. So this is, again, a school of thought that was popular in Germany. If you notice, the Germans keep coming up in the early history of psychology because that was a hotbed of psychology at the time. So the Gestalt basically is a German term that refers to the organized whole. So sensing and perceiving could not be broken down into components. So like structuralism and objective introspection and all those other preceding theories that try and deal directly with consciousness by breaking down internal perceptions, that it's just not meaningful, that in some way that might be arbitrary even. So there are a number of Gestalt ideas that are now a part of cognitive psychology, and we'll touch on that later on in a coming chapter. I believe it's chapter 5 when we talk about sensation and perception. There's actually some pretty neat Gestalt ideas that we still use today when we discuss perception. So another really important figure to know is Sigmund Freud. There's his personal dates there as well. He's credited with psychoanalysis. Now, I am just freely admitting a bias. That's something whenever you're reading or listening to somebody that you should attempt to make yourself aware of, is what bias may be present. Freud is not my favorite, but his theories are very, very important. So even though he's not my favorite, his research was very heuristic. So that means that his research caused a lot of other people to do research too. And a lot of that was because what he had to say was not well received by others in the psychological community. And so there were a number of people that set out to do additional research to prove him wrong. And then several others that, to his defense, wanted to research more thoroughly to prove him right. Sigmund Freud, though, wasn't particularly interested in doing the research himself. A lot of the theories that he proposed really came from his meetings in private practice, so he was not an experimental researcher per se. So key ideas that come from Freud that we use today and discuss today in psychology are that childhood impacts adulthood, which seems completely obvious to us now, or at least I hope it does. But back when Freud was practicing, this was revolutionary. The psychologists believed that kids were just small adults. And so there's a number of things that we're going to discuss. We're going to hit on development a little bit later on in chapter 9. but that's revolutionary, and it has several key applications when we get to talking about working with children, and you'll especially talk about that quite a bit if you go on to take developmental psychology. Freud also argued that personality is formed early in life and remains stable across the lifespan, which then again plays into the childhood impacting adulthood. He also proposed the notion of the id, the ego, and the superego. So if you've seen like the iceberg chart, we'll talk about that later on when we talk about personality. And then he also, his practices form the basis of psychotherapy. So Freud believed that people could experience change through psychoanalysis and connecting them to events that maybe happened earlier in their life that might be impacting them today, so that those insights then allow them to kind of recognize the influence and then maybe make different changes. Okay, so John Watson was somewhat contemporary to Freud. His career went on a little longer, and he is one of the founders of behaviorism, which is the science of the study of behavior. So he completely ignored consciousness. So unlike functionalism, which wanted to know how your consciousness may impact your daily life, he completely ignored it, and he focused only on observable behavior. He did not care a lick for motivation, because that was kind of like consciousness, that you couldn't directly and objectively measure that. So he emphasized conditioning, and so we will talk quite a bit about that in chapter 6. So there were a couple of experiments that you may have heard about. There was an experiment with a child that's called Little Albert about conditioning, like fear conditioning. And then Pavlov is credited with some discoveries related to conditioning. Pavlov wasn't actually intending to be a psychologist. He was a physiologist that happened upon a psychological principle that he was able to describe through his other research. But in general, then, what we credit to John Watson is the idea that all behavior can be described in terms of stimulus and response. And again, we will go into depth with that in chapter 6. The field was later headed by B.F. Skinner. So like the Skinner box, which we'll talk about briefly in chapter 6, was what B.F. Skinner used to study the behavior of animals and how they learn and that kind of thing. So behaviorism is very influential, and honestly is still somewhat influential today. So we will talk about it quite a bit in chapter 6. Okay, so despite the fact that I subtitled this Old Dead White Guys, I do want to let you know that there were in fact minorities in psychology. They didn't necessarily have the same opportunities as their counterparts, but they were present. Some of the minorities then, because they couldn't, I'm using air quotes, but you can't see it, they couldn't study mainstream psychology, went and did a lot of work in fields like educational psychology. So we owe a debt of gratitude to those that persevered even in an area where they experienced some discrimination. By the way, we'll also talk about discrimination later on in this course. Okay, so I wanted to also give you a brief breakdown of current perspectives. So as these historical fields that I've mentioned so far have evolved, we've basically got these breakdowns into the more modern elements of psychology. So we've got neuroscience, evolutionary psych, behavioral genetics, psychodynamic perspective, behavioral perspective. Like I said, behaviorism still has a lot of influence. Cognitive psychology and sociocultural psychology. I encourage you to take this list and read the focus and some example sample questions and think about these fields and which field you might more closely identify with, or which field may interest you the most. Okay, so recent developments. So the humanistic perspective, Abraham Maslow was really important to that perspective. We'll talk about it later on in this course. But the core belief of the humanistic perspective is that people have the ability to direct their own lives using their free will. Self-actualization is actually a concept that comes out of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The cognitive perspective, which is deals with people's ability to think, remember, store, and use information. That's cognitive and neuro are my favorites. So cognitive neuroscience is kind of where those two ideas blend. So cognitive perspective studies memory, intelligence, perception, thought processing, problem solving, language, and learning. Again, those are some of my favorites. And we've got a chapter on each of them here in this textbook, so we will be covering that in more detail later. The sociocultural perspective deals with thinking and behaving influenced by social factors. So individuals do not exist in a vacuum, that they can be influenced by their social groups, by their cultural groups, or by the group that they identify with. Biopsychological perspective attempts to explain the relationship between biological events and behavior and perception. So things like neurotransmitters and all kinds of stuff, that there may be some science, some direct science and chemistry underpinning and motivating some behaviors and some decisions. So we will talk about the biopsychological perspective quite a bit when we are in chapter 3, and we're actually, chapter 3 is about the most science-heavy chapter in this book, and it's all dedicated to biopsychology. So the evolutionary perspective, so that's the idea that there is an underlying biological basis for the shared characteristics across humans. So there can be a lot of cultural variation, but then we see things that are common across culture. So things like many cultures have creation myths or have some sort of coming of age ritual or those kind of things. There's also more kind of elemental behavioral things that seem common. So one of the examples that I like to give in class is the idea of, why do people lie? So pause the video, take a second and think about it. Really think about it. Why do people lie? If you're a parent, pause this video and think about, did I have to teach my kid how to lie? So turns out we don't really have to train lying, that there is just something about it, whether it's pure self-preservation or whatever, the attempt to lie then is pretty common across humanity. And so what influences how often somebody lies is often whether or not they get away with it or what the consequence is when they get caught. Okay, so why are there so many ideas? So each of the schools of thought that we have discussed, either the historical ones that led to changes in how we look at psychology and other areas of study, or the more modern ones that we've talked about over the last couple of minutes, every single one of those schools of thought has added something to how we understand behavior and how we understand thought processes. Sometimes it just encouraged research and we headed in a new direction as we got more research. Other times we've blended things together. So there is no unified theory of psychology. There's no one theory that explains every single thing. And when you turn around and compare that to other branches like chemistry and physics, there are those appear a little bit more unified and organized. So often one of the questions that I ask is, will there ever be a unified theory of psychology? And it's worth taking a minute to think about that. And that will probably be, if I asked you this question today, you would give me an answer. And if I asked you a question later on in the semester, you might give me a different answer. So just kind of something to think about as you're reading all of these different topics in psychology as we go through this course. Okay, so don't worry about that assignment. That was from a previous semester. Again, visit the reading list, read over the stuff in the book. I pointed you to some page numbers for additional information. This video isn't meant to cover everything that you need to study for the week, but to at least kind of let you guys hear some of my thoughts on things. Please give me some feedback if you find the videos are helpful. They do take some time to create, and so I'm trying this brand new this semester. So give some feedback on that. Other than that, if you've got questions as you move through your assignments this week, don't hesitate to reach out. Again, the Labette email is the best way to get a hold of me. I look forward to hearing from you.